Iron is Hot is a documentary on sponge iron factories in India released in 2009 from directors Biju Topo and Meghnad Bhattacharya. This film convincingly overcomes the struggle of filming slow violence by portraying the harmful impact of sponge iron factories on Adivasi communities in Orissa, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and West Bengal by using filming techniques to show the negative impact on the land and surrounding environment, as well as conducting interviews with natives to show their struggle. Rob Nixon's Slow Violence Environmentalism of the Poor, published in 2011, coins the term slow violence, which Nixon defines on page 2 of his book as a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. Nixon created this term as a way to define the struggle of addressing slow violence acting on environmental issues. He writes that by redefining these issues in terms of slow violence, it would help raise awareness and call people to action to often ignored, slow-acting environmental problems, like deforestation and global warming. These slow-acting problems, coupled with the fact that slow violence tends to affect those of lower socioeconomic status, results in the consequences of slow violence issues being overlooked and forgotten. His definition especially applies to the communities in Orissa and West Bengal, where the buildup of sponge iron factory pollution occurred gradually and caused delayed destruction to the livestock and crops. The destruction of livestock and crops, in turn, caused destruction to the livelihood of the communities in Iron is Hot. Additionally, the air pollution was not immediately perceived, led to a battery of respiratory and skin diseases, which are slow, silent killers not typically considered as a form of violence. In Arundhati Roy's essay, The Greater Common Good, published in 1999 as a part of a collection, The Cost of Living, she portrays a slow violence through the statistics she provides in a narrative strategy. The displacement of the Adivasi people is considered slow violence because their displacement is not explosive or considered a typical form of violence. Rather, the violence that the Adivasi people experience is that of voiceless ethnic otherness. The government systematically ignores their protest and continues with the construction of the dam as a means to push them out of the community, which negatively affects their livelihood in an act of slow violence. Throughout The Greater Common Good, Roy notes the horrifically large amounts of people displaced by the dam, as well as the government's incorrect estimation of the numbers. By sharing the numbers with the audience, Roy creates a shock factor that further captures the audience's attention. Additionally, through a narrative storytelling strategy, Roy elaborates on specific people's struggles so the audience can relate to and see the specific impact the dam has had on the Adivasi community. One example of a story of a specific person that Roy details on page 78 of her essay is the story of Bahi Baji, who, according to Roy, became a pauper overnight. Through her recollection of a night she spent with him and the memory of seeing him in a documentary film 10 years earlier, the audience shares her outrage at his situation. This is a very effective tactic for showing slow violence. When viewing The Iron is Hot, this same narrative tactic is used again, successfully, by Biju Topo and Meghnad Bhattacharya, through interviewing the community affected by sponge iron factories.
Topo and Bhattacharya frequently use wide shots in the film. This technique helps overcome the challenges of portraying slow violence because the audience can see the destruction of the land for themselves. Additionally, the technique allows the audience to view how widely the pollution epidemic has spread. Through wide shots panning over the Orissa landscape, Topo and Bhattacharya emphasize the lack of life within the previously fertile land. Within the image, monstrous mounds of ash beside the road of the Adivasi village in Orissa cover the foreground, and a skinny barren tree stands to the right of the image, emphasizing the lack of fertility in the landscape. In the far background, there are several fields. The director's choice to include signs of agriculture and life and contrast the black mound of ash with the small splashes of green in the far distance emphasize how distant the fertile past of the land is. The screenshot from the film emphasizes the proximity of the pollution to the homes and livelihood of the communities near the sponge iron factories. The film is filled with similar views. Once scenic forests and pastures, now wastelands with a thick coating of dust. In most films, directors display wide-sweeping landscape shots to portray the majesty of the landscape. In contrast, Topo and Bhattacharya use the film shot to show the destruction. The juxtaposition of how this technique is normally used strengthens the shock factor and effectiveness as a tool to portray slow violence.
In a snapshot of the film's narrative strategy, pictured on the left is an aged Indian woman standing in the center of the picture with her hands held out to the camera. White, peeling skin covers her swollen fingers, evidence of her everyday toil in the fields. With a scene depicting the bodily ailments of a female field worker, the directors portray the detriments of the pollution on the health of the community. The field workers have no choice but to continue working for their livelihood. However, their health continues to deteriorate in spite of their efforts. The director's choice to include an interview with a woman suffering from a skin ailment effectively portrays slow violence because the skin condition takes time to progress. However, the villagers with the illness have no way to afford medical treatment, nor do they have time or methods to clean and purge the pollution before continuing their work in the fields. While it is difficult to capture the short-term effects of slow violence, the directors effectively and intentionally use the visible physical struggles of this villager to show the long-term and irreversible damage of sponge iron dust. With the narrative strategy, the directors can personify the direct factory to human impact of sponge iron factories on the Adivasi people. This strategy is effective as viewers can physically see the impact of slow violence of the sponge iron factories on the villagers.